Chapter 1: The Epidemic and the Myths. It did not require a deep investigation to find the symptoms. They were broadcast across every corner of American daily life. On a popular reality television program, a teenager planning her 16th birthday demanded that a major roadway be closed so a full marching band could announce her arrival on a red carpet. A children's book emerged to explain the concept of mommy's plastic surgery to toddlers. Companies began offering services where ordinary people could hire fake paparazzi to follow them around, shouting their names and taking photographs to manufacture the illusion of celebrity. Popular music unapologetically celebrated the idea that the world should revolve around the singer. Infants were dressed in bibs, labeling them as supermodels or bosses, sucking on pacifiers adorned with fake diamonds. Home buyers took on astronomical debts to live in mansions they could not afford, a trend that eventually brought the global financial system to its knees. These are not isolated incidents of eccentricity. They are the visible symptoms of a profound psychological shift. American culture has been swallowed by an epidemic of relentless, unapologetic narcissism. To understand the scale of this phenomenon, one must look beyond the severe clinical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, which itself has surged. The true danger lies in the cultural environment that normalizes these behaviors. Standards have shifted so dramatically that even humble, modest individuals find themselves sucked into the vortex of endless self-promotion, aggressive materialism, and an obsession with physical appearance. It operates exactly like a contagious disease. It has root causes, vectors of transmission, distinct symptoms, and requires targeted treatments. Yet, unlike physical ailments, this epidemic was born out of well-intentioned cultural ideals. For decades, the pursuit of self-admiration has been prescribed as a universal remedy. The cultural messaging insists that believing in oneself, loving oneself above all else, is the absolute prerequisite for happiness and success. This belief system transformed self-esteem into a national wonder drug. The intentions were undoubtedly noble. However, this fervent embrace of self-admiration has crossed a dangerous threshold. The language of self-worth has blurred into the territory of extreme self-centeredness. Consider the bride who commissioned her wedding cake to be sculpted as a life-sized replica of herself. Consider the preschools where toddlers begin their mornings by singing songs about how special they are and demanding that everyone look at them. This emphasis on inherent specialness is a relatively modern and uniquely American phenomenon. In many other cultures, humility and the continuous effort to improve one's weaknesses are valued far above bragging. Yet, the prevailing cultural tide in America continues to insist that every individual is a singular, extraordinary force deserving of constant praise. When self-admiration is pushed to such extremes, it morphs into something far darker. It becomes narcissism. The term finds its origins in the Greek myth of Narcissus, the beautiful young man who fell so deeply in love with his own reflection in a pool of water that he could not pull himself away, eventually dying there, completely disconnected from the rest of the world and oblivious to the suffering of those who cared for him. This mythological tragedy perfectly encapsulates the modern condition. The defining characteristic of a narcissist is an inflated, grandiose view of the self. They genuinely believe they are more intelligent, more attractive, and more important than those around them, even when objective reality proves otherwise. They feel entitled to special treatment. But the most crucial distinction between a healthy sense of self-worth and toxic narcissism is the absence of warm, empathetic connections with others. A person with healthy self-esteem values their relationships and cares about the feelings of their peers. A narcissist views other people primarily as tools to be manipulated, an audience to provide applause or stepping stones to achieve greater status. To maintain this inflated self-image, continuous effort is required. This often results in a lifelong campaign of self-regulation through bragging, obsessing over appearances, flaunting material wealth, and dominating conversations. When these strategies succeed, the individual experiences a rush of superiority. When they fail, the reaction is often one of profound anger and hostility. To accurately measure these traits in the general population, psychologists utilize tools like the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, which forces individuals to choose between equally desirable statements, one modest and one narcissistic. The results of such assessments over the past few decades reveal a staggering truth, but they also bring to light several pervasive misunderstandings about the nature of this personality trait. The first major misconception is that narcissism is simply the equivalent of exceptionally high self-esteem. While it is true that those who score high in narcissistic traits also report high self-esteem, the nature of that esteem is vastly different. Narcissists believe they are superior in domains of power, status, and physical attractiveness. They do not claim to be the most compassionate, moral, or caring individuals. They lack the grounding perspective that comes from genuine emotional intimacy. The second, and perhaps most widespread myth, is the belief that narcissists are secretly insecure, utilizing their grandiosity as a mask to hide deep-seated feelings of inadequacy or self-loathing. This mask model is heavily favored by pop psychology and television dramas because it allows society to view arrogant individuals as wounded souls in need of more love and validation. However, advanced psychological testing, including methods that measure unconscious, split-second associations, proves this theory false. Deep down in their unconscious minds, narcissists truly believe they are awesome. They do not harbor hidden insecurities. Their internal self-image is just as inflated and secure as the outward persona they project. Treating a bully's arrogance by trying to boost their self-esteem is akin to treating an obese patient by feeding them more sugar. They do not need more self-admiration, they need to learn respect for others. A third myth assumes that these individuals might actually be justified in their arrogance because they possess superior talents or physical beauty. Objective measurements systematically dismantle this idea. They do not score higher on intelligence tests, and independent observers do not rate them as more physically attractive. They are simply masters of curation, adept at selecting the most flattering photographs of themselves and loudly taking credit for successes while displacing blame for failures. A fourth myth suggests that a certain amount of narcissism is healthy and necessary for survival. This presents a false dichotomy between loving oneself to excess and hating oneself entirely. It is entirely possible to navigate life with confidence, engage deeply in one's work, and enjoy fulfilling relationships without constantly obsessing over one's own greatness. While a narcissistic rush might aid in a brief public performance, any trait whose primary mechanism involves the exploitation and disregard of others cannot be classified as fundamentally healthy. The final myth reduces the condition to mere physical vanity. While an obsession with appearance is a prominent symptom, the pathology extends far beyond the mirror. It infects one's relationship with money, fostering extreme materialism and the accumulation of debt. It breeds a profound sense of entitlement, leading to antisocial behaviors, a breakdown of civility, and a readiness to exploit intimate partners and colleagues alike. The data confirming the explosive growth of this cultural affliction is undeniable. Extensive analyses of tens of thousands of college students over 3 decades demonstrate that narcissistic traits have risen as rapidly as the obesity rate. The generations previously famous for their self-absorption have been vastly outpaced by their children. By the mid-2000s, an alarming percentage of young adults were scoring significantly higher on these inventories, representing a massive cultural shift. Clinical interviews reinforce this reality, revealing that nearly 1 in 10 Americans in their 20s has experienced the severe symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder at some point, a rate exponentially higher than that found in older generations. Yet, rather than viewing this as a crisis, many young people and cultural commentators have embraced it, arguing that this extreme self-focus is justified because they belong to the greatest generation yet to exist. They reframe vanity as pride and view extreme self-confidence as a necessary armor for a highly competitive world. This rationalization is the ultimate victory of the epidemic, a culture so deeply infected that it no longer perceives its own illness, mistaking the symptoms of a destructive pathology for the very blueprint of success. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Success and Its Origins. Isn't narcissism beneficial, especially in a competitive world? Challenging another myth about narcissism. Listen to the ambient noise of modern life, and a single word dominates the conversation: competitive. We hear about the fierce competition for jobs, the ruthless race for college admissions, and the looming threat of the global economy outsourcing our livelihoods. In certain neighborhoods, this competitive frenzy begins at age 2, with parents fighting for spots in elite preschools and purchasing developmental videos for children still in the womb. By high school, it reaches a fever pitch. Students exhaust themselves on a treadmill of advanced classes, test preparation, and highly paid consultants hired simply to craft the perfect application essay. The playing field, it seems, is a battleground, in a convenient merging of this intense competitiveness with our cultural worship of self-admiration. A deeply rooted myth has taken hold. It is the belief that to survive and thrive in this cutthroat environment, one must aggressively put oneself first. Society whispers and sometimes shouts that having an enormous ego is the primary prerequisite for victory. When researchers point out the rising tide of self-centeredness, the common defense is that young people must be obsessed with themselves just to get ahead. Pundits, students, and even educators argue that in a bottom-line society, the most direct route to that bottom line is a me-first attitude. They take it as an absolute given that supreme self-confidence, even bordering on arrogance, is the engine of achievement. There is only one problem with this universally accepted cultural script. It is fundamentally false. Narcissism and success. Narcissists desperately love to win. They crave the podium, the spotlight, and the accolades. Yet, when placed in most real-world settings, they are surprisingly poor at actually achieving sustained victory. Studies examining college students with inflated self-views reveal a harsh reality. The longer they remain in school, the worse their grades become, and they are significantly more likely to drop out entirely. When confronted with a failing grade, those with the highest narcissistic traits do not change their study habits. They stubbornly maintain their illusions of brilliance. Overconfidence backfires because it acts as a shield against learning. A narcissist cannot absorb criticism, refuses to learn from mistakes, and reflexively blames external forces, the teacher, the test, the environment, for their own shortcomings. Furthermore, if you are fundamentally convinced of your own genius, the motivation to improve simply evaporates. Why run the bases when you firmly believe you were born on home plate? This detachment from reality manifests in a phenomenon psychologists call overclaiming. Narcissists are notorious know-it-alls. In controlled assessments where subjects are asked to identify historical facts or cultural figures, narcissists will confidently claim intimate knowledge of completely fabricated people and events. They are so assured of their vast intelligence that they know things that do not even exist. This same dynamic plays out in financial markets. Because narcissists are absolutely certain of their own instincts, they possess an extraordinarily high tolerance for risk. In a booming bull market, this gambling pays off handsomely, allowing the narcissist to briefly appear as a financial visionary. However, the moment the market turns, this identical overconfidence leads to catastrophic ruin. The mortgage and credit meltdowns of the late 2000s were propelled by exactly this mechanism, a toxic blend of overconfident lenders issuing risky loans and entitled buyers grasping for mansions they objectively could not afford. The short-term rush of imaginary success inevitably surrendered to the brutal gravity of reality. Even at the highest levels of corporate leadership, the myth of the necessary ego shatters under scrutiny. Exhaustive research into companies that transitioned from merely good to truly great reveals that the most successful CEOs are not charismatic, chest-thumping titans. They are, almost universally, humble, quiet, and relentless individuals who deflect credit to their teams and continuously strive to learn. Narcissistic executives, on the other hand, produce highly volatile company performance, pursuing flashy, high-risk acquisitions just to keep their names in the press. Like the architects of the infamous Enron collapse, men who believed they were the smartest guys in the room, they are master illusionists. They ascend to leadership quickly due to their dominant presence, but their reigns are notoriously short-lived once their peers recognize their inability to share glory or function within a team. The only arena where narcissism genuinely aids performance is the isolated stage of solo public performance, such as a reality television audition where the spotlight demands nothing but pure, unadulterated self-focus. Self-esteem and success. If narcissism is destructive, surely its gentler cousin, self-esteem, is the key to unlocking human potential. The editorial pages of newspapers constantly warn that if we do not tell our children how special they are, we risk crushing their spirits and destroying their futures. American culture operates on the baseline assumption that you must believe in yourself before you can achieve anything. The empirical data tells a completely different story. Comprehensive reviews of scientific literature conclude that high self-esteem does not cause better grades, superior test scores, or improved job performance. The connection between the two is simple. Success causes self-esteem, not the other way around. Earning a good grade or being a loyal friend generates a sense of worth. Attempting to reverse engineer success by artificially inflating self-esteem is an exercise in futility. Consider the global academic landscape. American students consistently rank at the top of the world in self-confidence regarding their math skills, yet they routinely perform drastically lower on objective tests than students from countries like South Korea, who report very low confidence but deliver exceptional results. In the United States, 3 decades of dedicated self-esteem boosting in classrooms have yielded less than a 1% improvement in actual learning, while the number of students self-reporting A averages has skyrocketed by over 80%. We have successfully inflated the fantasy of success without actually improving the reality. When well-meaning educators attempt to intervene by sending failing students messages designed to boost their self-worth, telling them to hold their heads high and feel good about themselves regardless of their grades, the results are disastrous. In controlled experiments, students who received these self-esteem boosts actually saw their final grades plummet compared to students who received no psychological coddling at all. Bizarrely, even as they failed the course, these students reported feeling fantastic about themselves. We are not advocating for a culture of self-hatred or insecurity. Having an accurate, non-defensive understanding of your own strengths and weaknesses is essential. True mastery requires the humility to listen to those wiser than you, the resilience to endure years of unglamorous effort, and the capacity to become so deeply absorbed in your work that you entirely forget about yourself. Why do Americans think narcissism is so important to success, even though it isn't? Competition and self-promotion. If the data is so clear, why does the illusion persist? The answer lies in the shifting economic realities of modern America. Inequality has risen sharply, and the historical social contract between loyal employee and paternalistic company has been severed. Pensions have vanished, replaced by an environment where individuals must constantly job hop to survive. In this climate of instability, the ability to self-promote has become a required survival skill. You must know how to polish a resume and package your personal brand to stand out. However, possessing the tool of self-promotion is vastly different from allowing it to consume your entire personality. It is entirely possible to advocate for yourself fiercely in a job interview and then return home to serve your family with deep humility. Narcissism demands that you use self-promotion not as a situational tool, but as a permanent state of existence. Narcissists' greater visibility. The illusion is further magnified by a psychological glitch known as the availability heuristic. We overestimate the frequency of things that easily come to mind. Narcissists are spectacular, loud, and relentless in their pursuit of the spotlight. We associate success with arrogance because the arrogant, successful people, the brash real estate tycoons plastering their names on skyscrapers, ensure we never stop looking at them. Meanwhile, the humble billionaires driving used cars and quietly donating their fortunes to charity remain invisible. We see the crashing airplanes, not the thousands of safe flights, creating a heavily distorted view of what achievement actually looks like. The trap of narcissism. Why would anyone adopt a mindset that ultimately leads to isolation and failure? Because narcissism operates as a time delay trap, mimicking the mechanics of addiction. In the short term, it feels incredible. It is deeply pleasurable to look in the mirror and believe you are flawless, to revel in the temporary adoration of a crowd, and to shield yourself from the pain of failure by blaming the world. But the trap eventually springs shut. The relentless self-absorption drives away genuine friends, leaving the narcissist surrounded only by sycophants who will vanish the moment the superficial charm fades. The refusal to accept criticism guarantees stagnation. Ultimately, the narcissist is left to confront the terrifying reality that they are fundamentally average and that the world will continue spinning without them. On a cultural level, narcissism functions like a fleet of massive SUVs on a highway. Initially, the driver enjoys an elevated view and a feeling of invincible safety. But the cost of that advantage is paid by everyone else on the road whose visibility is blocked and whose safety is compromised. As more people adopt the narcissistic armor just to survive the resulting incivility, the original advantage disappears, leaving society polluted, exhausted, and profoundly disconnected. How did we get here? Origins of the epidemic. To understand how this mindset captured the American psyche, we must examine the cultural timeline. If one had to pinpoint the exact moment the epidemic breached containment, it would be the 1970s, a decade remembered for its gaudy excesses, but truly defined by the psychological shifts that became the permanent status quo of our modern era. Self-admiration was not always a core American idea. It is vital to recognize that the worship of the self was not baked into the nation's original DNA. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were radical documents championing individual liberty, but that liberty was meticulously balanced with a profound commitment to equality, tolerance, and the common good. Early American ideals glorified the quiet dignity of hard work, self-reliance, and communal responsibility. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, surviving world wars and a Great Depression required a collective resilience that left absolutely no room for the luxury of self-obsession. Post-war America emphasized fitting in, contributing to the whole, and earning one's keep. The notion that an individual was inherently special simply by virtue of existing would have been met with total incomprehension. The 1960s. The cultural tectonic plates began to shift in the 1960s. Initially, the movements of this era were deeply communal, aimed at securing civil rights for marginalized groups, launching the Peace Corps, and organizing mass gatherings grounded in shared experience and mutual care. Even the counterculture's exploration of mind-altering substances was often framed as a method to dissolve the ego and connect more deeply with humanity. However, the decade also birthed the human potential movement. Originally designed to help individuals reach the pinnacle of psychological maturity, a state of self-actualization that required intense discipline and a profound empathy for others, the movement eventually took the path of least resistance. True self-actualization is arduous. Basic self-esteem is easy. As the 60s bled into the 70s, the rigorous pursuit of human potential was quietly replaced by the comforting, effortless doctrine of feeling good about oneself. The 1970s. By the time the 1970s arrived, the collective spirit of the previous decade had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of pure self-focus. Tom Wolfe accurately diagnosed the era as the me decade, chronicling a society that had abandoned its interconnected social systems in favor of treating the self as an object of religious veneration. People flocked to seminars where they paid to scream away their insecurities, entirely absorbed in the meticulous curation of their own internal landscapes. Simultaneously, the fabric of community began to fray. Civic memberships plummeted, divorce rates spiked, and a hyper-individualistic singles culture emerged under the strobe lights of the disco era. Even the therapeutic community underwent a radical transformation. Where psychologists once treated patients suffering from severe emotional repression, they were suddenly inundated with clients whose lives were falling apart due to rampant self-centeredness. It was in 1980 that narcissistic personality disorder was officially recognized in the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, codifying the damage the decade had wrought. The 1980s and beyond. Rather than correcting itself, the culture doubled down. The malaise of the 70s transitioned into the aggressive, materialistic vanity of the 1980s. A self-perpetuating cycle was born. A society enamored with self-admiration began raising its children to believe they were royalty, and educational systems restructured themselves around the protection of feelings rather than the pursuit of excellence. The media eagerly poured fuel on the fire. The obsession with the lifestyles of the rich and famous normalized a standard of living detached from actual achievement. Daytime talk shows and the eventual explosion of reality television provided a blueprint for how to achieve fame without talent, elevating the most dramatic, combative, and self-obsessed individuals to the status of cultural icons. When the internet arrived, it handed every citizen a global broadcasting network, completing the transition. We had evolved from a nation that valued quiet dignity into a society where the ultimate goal was to be seen, heard, and adored at all costs. Chapter 3. Raising Royalty. The Parenting Trap. The philosophy of raising children has undergone a radical transformation over the last few generations. In the past, the family was a clear hierarchy with the parents firmly established at the top. The needs of the family unit superseded the immediate desires of any single child. Today, however, the family structure often resembles an inverted pyramid, with the child resting comfortably at the pinnacle, dictating the schedule, the menu, and the emotional temperature of the entire household. This monumental shift was born from a collective desire to nurture and protect, to provide children with a childhood free from the rigid, sometimes harsh authoritarianism of earlier eras. However, the cultural pendulum has swung into highly dangerous territory. Society is no longer simply raising children, it is increasingly focused on raising royalty. This messaging often begins before the child can even formulate a sentence. Infants are routinely swaddled in clothing that labels them as princesses, bosses, or prodigies. The environment establishes an immediate, unquestionable baseline of entitlement, teaching the young mind early on that they are the indisputable center of the universe. When parents relentlessly broadcast the idea that their child is exceptionally special, universally unique, and destined for greatness simply by virtue of existing, they are planting the psychological seeds of an inflated ego. A child who is taught that they are inherently superior to the world around them does not develop a secure, healthy sense of self-worth. Rather, they develop an insatiable hunger for constant external validation and preferential treatment. This dynamic inevitably leads to a complete breakdown of traditional authority, resulting in profound role reversals within the home. In a desperate bid to be their child's best friend rather than their moral guide, parents willingly surrender their power. The child gradually begins to make the rules. When a toddler demands a different dinner than the one prepared for the rest of the family, the parent acts as a short-order cook. When a teenager refuses to participate in fundamental household chores, the parent quietly finishes the work to avoid a confrontation or a tantrum. This constant capitulation teaches the developing mind that adult authority is merely an illusion, and that their own fleeting desires will always supersede the needs of the broader community. A home where the child rules with absolute impunity is a laboratory for manufacturing narcissism. It produces young adults who will eventually enter the wider world completely unequipped to handle a society that does not recognize their imagined domestic sovereignty. Central to this disastrous parenting model is the phenomenon of overpraising. The current cultural mandate dictates that children must be constantly applauded for the most mundane, expected activities. Trophies are awarded simply for participation, completely untethered from the concepts of victory or defeat. Every crude drawing is framed as a masterpiece. Every clumsy attempt is heralded as a stroke of genius. While parents genuinely believe they are building an impenetrable fortress of self-esteem, they are actually feeding their children empty psychological calories. When praise is entirely detached from actual achievement, discipline, or effort, it loses all its meaning. The child internalizes the applause but deeply lacks the underlying competence to justify it. When they inevitably encounter an academic environment or a workplace that demands actual performance and critical feedback, the resulting shock is devastating. They simply do not realize they need to work hard or improve because they have been told repeatedly and emphatically that they are already perfect. The modern emphasis on hyper-competitiveness further distorts this developing personality. The subtle unwritten rule in many affluent households is that the child must be a winner above all else. Success is narrowly defined by outperforming peers, securing the highest grades, and dominating the extracurricular landscape. In this relentless pursuit of visible victory, the quiet foundational virtues of empathy, kindness, and cooperation are violently sidelined. Children are trained to be solitary warriors in a ruthless meritocracy rather than compassionate members of a shared society. They learn to view their peers not as potential friends or collaborators, but as obstacles to be overcome or stepping stones to be utilized. A child molded exclusively to conquer the world will often struggle to simply exist within it, finding it nearly impossible to form the deep, selfless, give-and-take relationships required for genuine human happiness. Halting the transmission of this epidemic to the next generation requires a fundamental and often uncomfortable restructuring of the parenting approach. It is entirely possible to raise a child who is deeply loved and fiercely protected without making them the center of the universe. The treatment begins with dismantling the culture of unearned praise. The focus must abruptly shift from applauding innate, unchangeable traits like basic intelligence or physical appearance to praising genuine effort, moral character, and resilience in the face of difficulty. A child must be allowed to experience the necessary friction of failure and disappointment, for it is only through navigating hardship that true, durable confidence is forged. Furthermore, the structure of the household must be corrected. Parents must reclaim their rightful authority, re-establishing the firm boundaries that make a child feel genuinely secure in a chaotic world. A family is a micro-community, and a child must learn early on to contribute to it, to compromise within it, and to recognize that the needs of others are just as vital and sometimes more pressing than their own. Only by replacing the heavy crown of entitlement with the quiet, enduring dignity of humility can we hope to immunize the next generation against the devastating psychological toll of the narcissism epidemic. Chapter 4: Superspreaders, Fame, Media, and the Web. In epidemiology, a superspreader is an individual or an event that transmits an infectious disease to an unusually large number of people, rapidly accelerating the timeline of an outbreak. The cultural epidemic of narcissism operates under the exact same mechanical principles. It does not simply pass from parent to child in the isolated confines of the home. It is broadcast globally, relentlessly, 24 hours a day. The vectors for this psychological virus are deeply embedded within our entertainment, our daily media consumption, and the digital architecture of our social lives. To trace the trajectory of this transmission, one must first examine the radical transformation of the concept of fame. Historically, fame was a byproduct. It was the unintended shadow cast by tremendous achievement, exceptional talent, or profound historical impact. A person became famous because they cured a disease, won a war, or authored a masterpiece. Today, the shadow has completely detached from the object. Fame is no longer the reward for a life well lived. It has become the ultimate destination itself. A significant portion of modern society, particularly the younger generation, harbors a deep, unironic desire to simply be famous, entirely divorced from any specific skill, craft, or contribution to society. The primary engine driving this cultural shift is the phenomenon of reality television. By stripping away the necessity for specialized talent, acting, writing, or musical ability, reality programming democratized the pursuit of celebrity. It broadcast a powerful subliminal message into millions of living rooms. Ordinary people can and should be famous. However, the individuals selected to populate these shows are rarely representative of the average population. Producers deliberately cast individuals possessing extremely high levels of narcissistic traits, because arrogance, entitlement, and a total lack of empathy generate reliable, profitable conflict. When these highly self-absorbed individuals are rewarded with massive exposure, magazine covers, and lucrative endorsements, society learns a dangerous lesson. We watch bad behavior being incentivized. We witness individuals treating their peers with breathtaking cruelty and being crowned as cultural icons for it. This relentless messaging does not spare the young. You are never too young to be targeted by the epidemic. Children's programming has subtly shifted its foundational narratives. Where previous generations of television heroes were ordinary kids navigating everyday moral dilemmas, modern youth programming frequently features protagonists who are secretly international pop stars, wealthy elites, or magical saviors. The underlying thesis of these narratives is that a quiet, ordinary life is a tragedy to be avoided, and that true fulfillment is only found when thousands of people are screaming your name. This creates a baseline expectation of grandeur in the developing mind, planting the seed that to be simply normal is to be a failure. If traditional media and celebrity culture manufactured the insatiable appetite for universal fame, the internet provided the global buffet. The transition from the early days of the internet, a read-only environment primarily used for gathering information, to the interactive ecosystem of Web 2.0 acted as an explosive accelerant for the narcissism epidemic. Suddenly, the barriers to mass communication completely dissolved. You no longer needed a television network to broadcast your daily life. You only needed a smartphone and a social media profile. The architecture of these social platforms is engineered to trigger and reward self-promotional behavior. They provide a highly curated stage where the individual is the sole star, director, and editor of their own idealized life. Users meticulously craft a digital persona, filtering out the mundane realities of daily existence to present a flawless highlight reel of achievements, aesthetic beauty, and fabricated happiness. In this digital realm, the fundamental nature of human connection is commodified. Friends are no longer people you deeply know and trust. They are metrics to be accumulated, an audience collected to validate the digital self. The pursuit of connection is replaced by the desperate, exhausting quest for attention, measured in likes, views, and digital applause. This digital environment also birthed a new era of unearned entitlement through blogs, video channels, and the omnipresent comment section. In theory, giving every human being a voice is the ultimate realization of democratic ideals. In practice, it has fostered an environment where every fleeting thought, no matter how uninformed or cruel, is treated as profoundly valuable simply because it is expressed. The internet values the sheer volume of expression over the quality or expertise behind it. This environment nurtures a specific breed of digital narcissism, the absolute conviction that one's personal opinion is a self-evident truth that the world is obligated to hear. The anonymity and physical distance provided by a screen remove the natural social friction that usually regulates arrogant or hostile behavior in the physical world. As a result, the comment sections of the internet often descend into a toxic wasteland of self-righteous fury and vitriol. Individuals feel completely entitled to relentlessly attack the intelligence and appearance of strangers, demanding that the world bend to their specific worldview. It is the ultimate manifestation of the narcissistic mind, a state where the individual ego reigns supreme, completely isolated from empathy, accountability, or the quiet dignity of simply listening to someone else. To halt the transmission of this virus, a radical digital diet is required. It necessitates a conscious, deliberate stepping back from the mechanisms of artificial validation. It requires recognizing reality television for the toxic psychological theater that it is, and understanding that the digital avatars we interact with online are not reality, but heavily edited illusions. Curing the individual of this affliction means learning to locate self-worth internally, through quiet competence and genuine private relationships, rather than surrendering it to the endless, demanding roar of the digital crowd. Chapter 5. The Fantasy Economy, Credit and Materialism. The cultural shift towards supreme self-admiration did not merely change how people looked in the mirror, it radically transformed how they interacted with the economy. For a narcissist, the internal belief of superiority is entirely insufficient if it remains invisible to the outside world. To feel truly dominant, that internal grandiosity must be physically manifested, broadcasted to neighbors, peers, and strangers alike. In a modern consumer society, the most efficient language for communicating dominance is the accumulation of premium goods. Consequently, the epidemic of narcissism ignited an unprecedented explosion in spending, warping the American dream from a quiet pursuit of financial security into a desperate, loud performance of ostentatious wealth. To understand how an entire society was permitted to indulge in this financial theater, one must look at the psychological guardrails that were systematically dismantled. The pioneering psychologist Sigmund Freud posited that human development requires a difficult transition between two distinct mindsets. The first is the pleasure principle, the infantile state that demands immediate gratification. A child operates under the belief that if they want something, they must have it right now. The mark of maturity is the transition to the reality principle, the sober understanding that resources are finite, desires must often be delayed, and actions carry inevitable consequences. For generations, the reality principle was strictly enforced by the unyielding mathematics of a bank account. If the cash was not there, the purchase was simply impossible. However, the modern financial industry engineered a profound psychological regression by flooding the market with frictionless, easy credit. Credit cards and subprime mortgages acted as a cultural time machine, returning adult consumers to the infantile state of the pleasure principle. The fundamental economic question shifted drastically from, "Can I afford this?" to, "Do I deserve this?" In a culture deeply infected with extreme self-entitlement, the answer to the latter question is always a resounding, aggressive yes. Millions of people were convinced that they inherently deserved the granite countertops, the imported luxury vehicles, and the sprawling, cavernous homes, completely regardless of their actual economic output. The reality principle was essentially repealed, replaced by the delusion that one could simply borrow their way into a higher social class. The tragic consequence was an entire society living out a collective financial hallucination, a fantasy that inevitably culminated in catastrophic market collapses when the illusion finally shattered against the bedrock of actual mathematics. But why the desperate, unyielding need to accumulate so much in the first place? The answer lies in the deeply materialistic nature of the epidemic. Materialism serves as the primary oxygen supply for the narcissistic ego. Because these individuals lack a solid, internally grounded sense of self-worth, they must constantly construct it externally. They do not buy things for their utility, they buy them for their signaling power. The spending explosion was driven by the psychological need to project an aura of unparalleled success. This hyper-materialistic arms race created a societal obsession with mimicking the absolute upper echelons of wealth. Financial commentators have described the emergence of Richistan, a metaphorical parallel nation populated by the ultra-wealthy, complete with its own isolated economy of mega-yachts, private aviation, and domestic staffs. While the vast majority of the population could never genuinely reside in Richistan, the entitlement epidemic convinced them that they were absolutely obligated to look as though they did. This birthed the massive luxuryification of the middle class. Everyday, mundane commodities were aggressively rebranded as exclusive luxury experiences. A simple cup of coffee became a heavily customized status symbol. A baby stroller became a competitive indicator of class dominance. Handbags transformed into physical representations of personal value. The goal was no longer merely to keep up with the neighbors, but to visibly crush them under the weight of superior purchasing power. It created a society of people who were perpetually exhausted and secretly broke, drowning in high-interest debt just to maintain the aesthetic of royalty. This fantasy economy exacts a devastating toll not just on the emotional and financial stability of the individual, but on the physical world itself. The environmental impact of this widespread narcissistic materialism is staggering and largely ignored. To satisfy the relentless demand for newer, bigger, and shinier status symbols, immense natural resources are continuously extracted, processed, and shipped across the globe, only to be hastily discarded into expanding landfills the moment the next aesthetic trend emerges. Massive, poorly insulated homes, constructed entirely to impress onlookers with their square footage, require vast amounts of energy to heat and cool. The quest to project a unique dominant identity through endless consumption essentially demands that the earth itself be strip-mined to feed the bottomless appetite of the human ego. We are, quite literally, mortgaging the future of the planet simply to purchase temporary props for an artificial performance of wealth. Chapter 6. Obsession, Vanity, and the Cult of Uniqueness. For the deeply self-absorbed individual, internal feelings of superiority are entirely useless if they do not successfully capture the gaze of the outside world. The ego cannot survive in a vacuum. It requires an audience. Therefore, the body itself is weaponized, transformed from a vessel of human experience into a walking, breathing billboard designed exclusively to command attention and project dominance. Vanity, a trait historically cautioned against as a profound moral failing, has been entirely rebranded. It is no longer a sin to be overcome. It is a mandatory, fiercely competitive daily pursuit. The cultural mandate is clear. It is not enough to simply look presentable or even beautiful. One must look undeniably better, flashier, and more provocative than everyone else in the room. This aggressive physical self-promotion manifests in a relentless obsession with aesthetics. The modern landscape is saturated with the performative display of the physical form. Gyms are less frequently treated as centers for cardiovascular health and increasingly utilized as sculpting studios for the ego, where the primary goal is achieving a highly specific, socially validated aesthetic to be immediately photographed and distributed. Clothing choices have shifted toward the explicitly revealing or the outrageously loud, functioning as a desperate mechanism to ensure that the wearer cannot possibly be ignored. The goal is to walk into a space and entirely dominate the visual field, forcing the surrounding environment to act as mere background players to their central starring role. However, the most chilling symptom of this vanity is how far society is willing to push the boundaries of physical manipulation. We have witnessed the complete normalization of plastic surgery. What was once a secretive, extreme measure, traditionally reserved for reconstructive necessity, or the aging elite desperately clinging to youth, has become utterly mundane. It is discussed with the same casual indifference as scheduling a haircut or a dental cleaning. The threshold for going under the knife has plummeted. Young adults, and increasingly adolescents, are voluntarily subjecting themselves to serious medical procedures, anesthesia, and recovery times, not to correct deformities, but to alter perfectly normal human features to fit a manufactured temporary standard of artificial perfection. They approach the surgeon like a customer at a custom auto body shop, asking for a specific nose, enhanced features, or the complete reshaping of their physique. The profound medical risks, the physical pain, and the financial burden are completely disregarded, entirely eclipsed by the anticipated rush of looking in the mirror and finally seeing the flawless, superior being they believe they deserve to be. The physical body is no longer accepted as a natural given. It is treated as a rough draft, a continuous project of surgical and cosmetic upgrades in the endless pursuit of an unattainable physical supremacy. Yet a profound anxiety haunts the modern narcissist. What if, despite the relentless grooming and the surgical interventions, they end up looking exactly like every other perfect person? The ego demands more than just beauty. It demands absolute, undeniable singularity. It is not enough to be attractive. One must be universally recognized as entirely distinct. This brings us to the parallel obsession that fuels the epidemic, the cult of uniqueness. If previous generations found comfort, safety, and a sense of shared purpose in conformity and community standards, the current culture views blending in as a fate worse than death. The ultimate cultural insult is to be labeled average or ordinary. The messaging broadcast to citizens from the moment they are born is that they are one of a kind, a completely unique arrangement of stardust unlike anything that has ever existed. Consequently, people feel immense, crushing pressure to constantly prove this uniqueness to the world. We have entered the era of the aggressively customized self. Every consumer choice, every digital avatar, every piece of clothing must be personalized, signaling to the masses that the individual refuses to be categorized. This desperate need to stand out is most glaringly obvious in the phenomenon of modern naming conventions. For centuries, children were named to connect them to their ancestry, their religion, or their culture, names that bound them to a larger historical community. Today, naming a child has evolved into a high-stakes competitive sport of forced originality. Parents scour the earth for incredibly obscure names, or they purposefully mutate the spelling of traditional names to ensure their child is never just another face in the classroom roll call. The child is handed a completely fabricated, highly difficult-to-spell name as their first badge of mandatory specialness. The tragedy, of course, is that the child is burdened with the expectation of being a revolutionary individual before they can even speak. The ultimate irony of this cult of uniqueness is its sheer mathematical impossibility. In a world of billions of people, true originality is exceptionally rare, usually born of profound, quiet thought, extreme dedication to a craft, or genuine artistic genius. Attempting to artificially construct a unique identity through consumer purchases, bizarre spelling variations, and loud vanity is an exhausting, hollow performance. When millions of people all simultaneously decide to rebel against the norm by purchasing the exact same rebellious clothing and adopting the exact same customized aesthetics, they do not achieve true individuality. They simply create a new, highly neurotic conformity. They become a massive flock of people, all desperately shouting, "Look at me, I am different!" in perfect, terrifying unison. The individual is left permanently anxious, constantly monitoring their social standing, terrified that their fragile, manufactured uniqueness will be compromised by someone slightly louder, slightly shinier, or slightly more outrageous. It is a treadmill of self-presentation that can never be turned off, leaving no time or energy for the quiet, unglamorous work of developing a truly meaningful inner life. Chapter 7. The Quest for Infamy and the Rise of Incivility, Antisocial Behavior. A functioning society is held together not by rigid laws or armed enforcement, but by millions of invisible threads of mutual respect. It is a quiet, daily social contract. We agree to wait our turn, to lower our voices in shared spaces, and to recognize that the stranger standing next to us possesses a life as vivid, complex, and valuable as our own. The psychological glue that binds this entire system together is empathy, the capacity to step outside the prison of one's own mind and genuinely feel the experience of another. The epidemic of narcissism acts as a powerful, corrosive solvent on this exact glue. When a culture glorifies extreme self-absorption, it systematically mass-produces individuals who suffer from a catastrophic deficit of empathy. The inevitable result is not just a society of vain individuals, but a culture defined by rising hostility, everyday cruelty, and a terrifying breakdown of basic human civility. To understand the antisocial nature of the narcissist, one must recognize how they view the surrounding world. For an individual deeply infected with this mindset, other human beings do not actually exist as independent, autonomous equals. Instead, the rest of humanity is reduced to a supporting caste, divided strictly into two categories: mirrors and obstacles. A mirror is someone who provides validation, applause, and resources. They are useful only as long as they reflect the narcissist's idealized self-image. An obstacle is anyone who stands in the way of their desires, who dares to offer criticism, or who simply demands to be treated with equal dignity. Because the narcissist firmly believes they are inherently superior, they operate under the absolute conviction that the normal rules of human conduct simply do not apply to them. This sense of overarching entitlement manifests first in the mundane, everyday friction of public life. We witness it in the driver who bypasses a miles-long line of traffic, entirely convinced that their destination is far more critical than the hundreds of people waiting patiently. We see it in the individual carrying on a blaring speakerphone conversation in a quiet cafe, completely oblivious or aggressively indifferent to the discomfort of everyone in the room. This is not merely bad manners or a momentary lapse in judgment. It is the physical expression of a deeply rooted worldview. The narcissistic mind computes a very simple, ruthless equation. My immediate convenience is vastly more important than your comfort. Treating others with basic politeness requires a fraction of a second of self-restraint and a tiny sacrifice of the ego, a sacrifice the heavily entitled individual finds utterly intolerable. However, when this inflated ego is challenged, the incivility rapidly escalates into direct aggression. A healthy individual, when faced with rejection or constructive criticism, might feel a temporary sting of sadness, followed by self-reflection. A narcissist experiences criticism as an unforgivable assault on their manufactured reality. When the mirror refuses to reflect perfection, the reaction is a phenomenon known as narcissistic rage. Because they lack the emotional maturity to process failure internally, they project it outward with ferocious hostility. They lash out, belittle, and attack the source of the criticism in a desperate bid to restore their own dominance. This deeply reactive anger fuels the modern epidemic of road rage, workplace bullying, and the vicious, unhinged vitriol that defines so much of online communication. It creates a societal atmosphere of hypervigilance, where ordinary people must constantly walk on eggshells to avoid triggering the explosive, fragile egos of those around them. The darkest and most terrifying symptom of this empathy deficit, however, is the modern quest for infamy. In a culture that worships fame and equates attention with human value, the most dangerous individuals are those who crave the spotlight but lack the talent or the discipline to earn it through positive achievement. For the deeply pathological narcissist, being ignored is a fate far worse than being hated. If they cannot force the world to look at them by doing something great, they will force the world to look at them by doing something horrific. This twisted psychological mechanism lies at the heart of much modern, premeditated violence. Historically, antisocial acts were often driven by severe economic desperation, gang territorialism, or deep-seated ideological fanaticism. Today, we increasingly witness atrocities committed for the sheer, explicit purpose of capturing media attention. Individuals draft manifestos, orchestrate their crimes for maximum visual impact, and carefully curate their physical appearance before committing horrific acts, treating a massacre not as a crime but as a twisted audition tape for historical immortality. They recognize that modern media systems will eagerly reward their violence with exactly what they desire: wall-to-wall coverage, the relentless broadcasting of their names, and the complete, undivided attention of a horrified public. In their broken, empathy-starved minds, the destruction of innocent lives is simply the acceptable price of admission to achieving global recognition. We are left with a chilling cultural landscape. By elevating the individual ego above all collective responsibility, we have inadvertently licensed a war of all against all. When empathy is discarded as a weakness and aggressive self-promotion is praised as a virtue, the social fabric inevitably tears. A society cannot function effectively when its citizens view every interaction as a zero-sum game of dominance, and when the simple act of recognizing the humanity in another person is treated as an unnecessary burden. Chapter 8. The Toll on Love and Labor. To fully comprehend the destructive power of the narcissism epidemic, one must observe how it dismantles the two foundational pillars of a meaningful adult life: the ability to maintain intimate relationships and the capacity to engage in productive work. When an individual operates under the absolute conviction that they are vastly superior to everyone around them, the concepts of mutual compromise in love and steady, unglamorous effort in the workplace become deeply offensive. The result is a trail of emotional wreckage in their personal lives and a chaotic, toxic trail of entitlement in their professional endeavors. The tragic irony of narcissistic relationships is that they often begin with spectacular, blinding brilliance. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as the chocolate cake trap. Imagine being offered a massive slice of rich, decadent chocolate cake. The initial experience is intensely pleasurable. It provides a massive, immediate rush of sugar and satisfaction. However, if one attempts to sustain a daily diet consisting exclusively of chocolate cake, the initial thrill rapidly gives way to nausea, malnutrition, and eventual physical collapse. A romantic relationship with a highly self-absorbed individual follows this exact, predictable trajectory. Narcissists are undisputed masters of the first impression. Because their entire psychological architecture is built around securing external validation, they are extraordinarily skilled at appearing charming, confident, and intensely engaging upon a first meeting. They are often impeccably dressed, highly articulate, and project an aura of thrilling self-assurance. For the unsuspecting partner, the beginning of the relationship feels like winning a lottery. They are swept off their feet by a dynamic, charismatic force, intoxicated by the sheer wattage of the narcissist's attention. During this brief honeymoon phase, the partner is placed on a pedestal, serving as a high-quality mirror reflecting the narcissist's own magnificent taste. But the sugar rush inevitably fades, and the trap springs shut. Once the narcissist has successfully acquired the partner, the intense effort to charm instantly evaporates. Because they fundamentally lack the capacity for deep emotional empathy, the critical, quiet work of sustaining a relationship, listening, compromising, and prioritizing the needs of another person is completely absent. The partner is violently pulled down from the pedestal and relegated to the role of a supporting cast member, whose sole purpose is to provide continuous applause and practical support. The relationship quickly devolves into a theater of manipulation. Narcissists do not view a romantic partner as an equal human being. They view them either as a trophy to be displayed to rivals or as a servant to manage the mundane details of life they feel too important to handle. They engage in psychological game-playing, purposefully keeping their partners off balance to maintain absolute control. They are notoriously prone to infidelity, not necessarily out of a desire for physical intimacy, but because their ego demands the continuous, validating conquest of new admirers. When the exhausted partner finally voices a complaint or demands basic emotional support, they are met not with understanding but with aggressive defensiveness or cold, dismissive contempt. The partner is ultimately left emotionally malnourished, realizing too late that they have invested their heart in an individual who is fundamentally incapable of loving anyone other than themselves. This exact same toxic entitlement infects the sphere of education and labor, creating an environment where the expectation of reward is entirely severed from the reality of effort. We have birthed a culture of all play and no work, where individuals sincerely believe that simply showing up entitles them to the highest possible accolades. This crisis is acutely visible on the modern college campus. Professors report a staggering increase in aggressive confrontations with students over grading. However, these disputes are rarely based on a student arguing the intellectual merit of their work. Instead, the student argues from a position of pure, unadulterated entitlement. They demand an A simply because they paid tuition, because they need it to get into a prestigious graduate program, or simply because they feel they are inherently an A student, regardless of the fact that they barely attended lectures and submitted deeply flawed work. The educational environment is no longer viewed as a rigorous arena for intellectual growth. It is treated as a consumer transaction where the customer is always right, and the professor is merely an obstacle blocking the delivery of a purchased credential. When this entitled mindset inevitably transitions into the workforce, it creates absolute chaos. The modern workplace relies heavily on collaboration, the slow mastery of skills, and the willingness to perform unglamorous tasks necessary for the functioning of the whole. The narcissist views all of this with profound disdain. They enter entry-level positions fully expecting to be handed corner offices, immediate executive authority, and rapid promotions within weeks of their hiring. When asked to perform routine duties, they act as though they have been deeply insulted, believing their immense unrecognized genius is being squandered on menial labor. Because they possess an inflated view of their own competence, they are terrible team players, constantly attempting to steal credit for collaborative successes while aggressively shifting the blame for any failures onto their colleagues. Furthermore, they are essentially unmanageable. Constructive feedback from a supervisor is not processed as a tool for professional development. It is perceived as a vicious, personal attack. An entitled employee will often respond to a negative performance review by threatening litigation, filing endless grievances, or quitting in a storm of righteous indignation, genuinely believing that the company will immediately collapse without their presence. This entitlement even extends its destructive reach to the natural environment. The belief that one deserves limitless comfort and immediate convenience inherently requires the massive, unsustainable consumption of the Earth's resources. An entitled society demands that the world provide continuous, cheap energy, overflowing disposable goods, and heavily climate-controlled environments, completely ignoring the long-term ecological devastation left in their wake. They operate under the delusion that the bill for their extravagant lifestyle will simply never come due, or that it will be paid by someone else in some distant future. Ultimately, by refusing to compromise in love and refusing to sweat in labor, the narcissistic individual engineers their own profound isolation. They leave behind a tragic legacy of emotionally drained partners, deeply frustrated colleagues, and a depleted world, remaining stubbornly blind to the reality that a life spent solely worshipping oneself is, in the end, a remarkably lonely and barren existence. Chapter 9. The Erosion of the Greater Good. Throughout human history, the pursuit of the divine and the commitment to charitable acts were universally recognized as the ultimate antidotes to selfishness. Religion and community service existed as sacred arenas where the individual ego was meant to be surrendered, offering a profound reminder that humanity is subservient to a higher power or a greater collective good. These institutions demanded humility, sacrifice, and the quiet dedication of the self to something vastly larger than one's own immediate desires. However, a cultural pathogen as pervasive as the narcissism epidemic does not recognize sacred boundaries. As the obsession with self-admiration saturated the culture, it quietly infiltrated the sanctuaries of faith and the foundations of philanthropy, mutating the search for spiritual meaning into yet another vehicle for personal self-promotion and individual entitlement. The transformation of the religious landscape over the past few decades is striking. Traditional theology, which historically emphasized awe, repentance, and a strict moral duty to the less fortunate, has been increasingly pushed to the margins. In its place, a highly customized, consumer-driven spirituality has emerged, perfectly tailored to flatter the modern ego. We witness the staggering rise of the prosperity gospel, a theological framework that explicitly promises divine wealth, perfect health, and limitless personal success to its followers. In this modern spiritual paradigm, the relationship between the human and the divine has been completely inverted. The Almighty is no longer viewed as a supreme, awe-inspiring creator demanding righteous conduct and personal sacrifice. Rather, the divine is rebranded as a cosmic life coach, a celestial concierge whose primary function is to guarantee the individual's material prosperity and continuously validate their inherent specialness. The fundamental message of this new theology is that the universe exists to serve you, and that failure to achieve massive financial success is simply a lack of sufficient faith in your own grand destiny. Consequently, many modern houses of worship have evolved to resemble massive corporate self-help seminars. Sermons are frequently entirely devoid of difficult moral demands, historical context, or discussions of communal obligation. Instead, massive congregations are treated to highly polished motivational speeches assuring them that they are uniquely destined for greatness, that they are royalty in the eyes of the universe, and that the Creator absolutely did not design them to be average. The profound, often challenging message of spiritual salvation is seamlessly replaced by the comfortable, effortless gospel of high self-esteem. When religious texts are stripped of their challenging moral friction and cherry-picked simply to provide daily affirmations, the individual is effectively worshipping a magnified reflection of themselves. The deeply transformative power of faith is neutralized, leaving the individual entirely insulated from the demanding, often uncomfortable realities of true spiritual devotion. This same insidious mechanism has severely compromised the realm of community service. True altruism is, by definition, an act of profound self-effacement. It involves performing necessary, often deeply unglamorous labor quietly, without any expectation of recognition, public applause, or personal reward. But the modern approach to volunteering has been heavily commodified and explicitly weaponized for social status. The epidemic of entitlement has given rise to the deeply paradoxical phenomenon of narcissistic altruism, the act of performing charity almost exclusively to secure an audience, build a competitive resume, or experience a public rush of moral superiority. The corruption of this ideal often begins early in the educational system. As high schools and universities increasingly institute mandatory volunteer hours or heavily weigh community service in highly competitive admissions processes, the fundamental nature of the act is destroyed. While the institutional intention is to instill a lifelong sense of civic duty, making charity a compulsory requirement for prestige transforms the act into a cynical, calculated transaction. Students are trained to view volunteering not as a quiet obligation to alleviate local suffering, but as an aggressive tactic to pad their applications. They are encouraged to compete for the most impressive, exotic service experiences possible, prioritizing visibility over actual utility. This hyper-competitive approach to charity has spawned the massive, lucrative industry of voluntarism. Affluent individuals now routinely pay thousands of dollars to travel to developing nations, spending a fleeting few days performing largely performative, unskilled labor. The undeniable focus of these expeditions is rarely the long-term structural improvement of the impoverished community. Rather, it is the immediate emotional experience of the tourist. The trip serves primarily to secure highly curated photographs of the volunteer surrounded by grateful locals, images that are instantly broadcast across global social networks. The charitable act is effectively reduced to a shiny, imported prop, utilized to loudly broadcast the volunteers' immense compassion and worldly sophistication to their peers back home. The true beneficiary of this transaction is not the struggling community left behind, but the ego and the digital profile of the temporary savior. When philanthropy becomes a competitive sport for social dominance and religion is reduced to an invisible mechanism for acquiring personal wealth and avoiding feelings of inadequacy, the epidemic has reached total cultural saturation. The very spaces historically designed to pull the individual out of the prison of their own mind have been conquered by the ego. Society is left spiritually malnourished, possessing massive, heavily funded institutions of charity and faith that ultimately serve only to endlessly echo the demands of the isolated, self-obsessed individual. The pursuit of the greater good has been tragically replaced by the endless, exhausting pursuit of the greater self. Chapter 10. The Prognosis and the Cure. Every epidemic possesses a defined trajectory. A pathogen emerges, finds a vulnerable population, exploits the vectors of transmission, and spreads until it either exhausts its fuel, is eradicated by an aggressive cure, or fundamentally permanently alters the landscape of the infected society. As we survey the vast cultural damage inflicted by the unchecked spread of extreme self-admiration, the broken relationships, the profound emotional exhaustion, the toxic workplaces, and the mountains of consumer debt, the critical question remains: how far and for how long will this epidemic continue to spread? The prognosis for the immediate future is deeply contested. There is a natural cyclical rhythm to human culture. Some sociologists argue that a society cannot sustain such a high fever of self-absorption indefinitely, predicting that the sheer exhaustion of maintaining this collective narcissistic performance will inevitably trigger a cultural backlash. They envision a pendulum swing, a sudden yearning for authenticity, quiet humility, and genuine community, born out of pure fatigue with the relentless, screaming demands of the ego. However, a more sober analysis of the current infrastructure suggests a much darker forecast. The psychological pathogen of narcissism has entrenched itself entirely within the structural pillars of modern life. The digital economy, the architecture of social media, the massive profitability of reality television, and the foundational philosophies of modern education are all currently calibrated to reward and amplify extreme self-focus. The most powerful mechanism that historically kept the ego in check was the unyielding, often brutal friction of objective reality. But modern society has spent decades successfully insulating itself against this friction, most notably through the explosive proliferation of easy credit. When an individual's grandiosity outpaced their actual competence or resources, reality once provided a swift, corrective blow. You could not live like royalty if you did not earn the wages of royalty. However, the financial systems of the late 20th and early 21st centuries essentially subsidized the epidemic, allowing millions to borrow their way into a fabricated reality. The catastrophic financial collapse that closed out the 2000s offered a brief, terrifying glimpse of the reality principle reasserting itself. For a fleeting moment, the culture was forced to confront the actual mathematical consequences of unearned entitlement. Yet, the deep-seated psychological craving for superiority remains largely untreated. Without a fundamental shift in cultural values, society will continually seek new destructive mechanisms to finance its illusions, ensuring the epidemic will simply mutate rather than disappear. Halting this trajectory requires an aggressive, multi-tiered approach to treatment. There is no single, miraculous vaccine for a cultural disease of this magnitude. The cure demands relentless, conscious effort on both the societal and the individual level. The treatment must begin at the source of transmission, the home and the school. We must radically redefine our approach to child-rearing and education. The era of empty, unearned praise must be entirely dismantled. Parents and educators must possess the courage to prioritize the development of moral character and genuine competence over the fragile, temporary comfort of artificial self-esteem. Children must be allowed to experience the necessary, constructive pain of failure. They must be taught that their inherent worth is not tied to a fabricated sense of absolute uniqueness or continuous external applause, but to their capacity for resilience, their willingness to learn, and their ability to treat their peers with profound empathy. We must stop telling children that they are the undisputed center of the universe and begin teaching them the quiet, enduring dignity of being a valuable, contributing member of a shared community. On an individual level, treating the narcissistic mind involves a fundamental rewiring of where one finds meaning. It requires deliberately cultivating habits that shrink the ego. One of the most powerful antidotes to self-absorption is the active practice of gratitude. A narcissistic mind focuses entirely on what it is owed and what it lacks. A grateful mind is anchored in an appreciation for what is already present, recognizing that the foundation of life is built upon the unseen efforts of countless others. Furthermore, individuals must be encouraged to seek out experiences of awe. Engaging deeply with the vastness of nature, grappling with complex art, or dedicating oneself to a spiritual practice that emphasizes humility all serve to place the individual in their proper context, as a small, interconnected part of a magnificent, larger whole, rather than the ruling deity of a private universe. Finally, we must consciously change our cultural diet. We must stop financially rewarding the superspreaders. This means turning off the reality programming that glorifies hostility and vanity, refusing to click on the digital bait of manufactured outrage, and actively choosing to consume media that elevates the human spirit rather than pandering to its lowest, most self-serving instincts. We must re-establish the boundaries of basic civility, demanding accountability in our public discourse, and refusing to normalize the toxic, antisocial behaviors that have become dangerously routine. And if we don't, the alternative is a slow, agonizing descent into a deeply fractured, high-friction society. If the epidemic is left untreated, the invisible threads of mutual trust that hold civilization together will eventually snap. A culture where every citizen views their neighbor not as an ally but as a competitor to be crushed or an obstacle to be manipulated cannot sustain the complex, cooperative systems required for a functioning democracy or a stable economy. We will be left with a world defined by profound, agonizing isolation, a society of millions of solitary rulers, each reigning over a completely empty kingdom, entirely disconnected from the profound, messy, beautiful reality of shared human experience. The choice is stark. We can either continue to worship the illusion in the mirror, or we can finally turn our gaze outward, recognizing that the true richness of life has always been found in the quiet, humble connection with others.